Putin is desperate. He wants an escape route from Ukraine. He will go back to Russia, he will rearm, and he will try again. That could be so calamitous it might trigger a nuclear response. So Europe wants Putin to unilaterally quit from Ukraine. And Trump is saying, actually, that can't happen, that won't happen. Ukraine is going to have to surrender something in order to get Putin to withdraw for the war to end. And everyone says, well, this is appeasement, pure and simple. And of course, the real issue is that if Putin is unable to spin this as anything else other than a defeat, he will lose power in Russia, he will be removed. And that actually could be more dangerous for Europe than Putin staying, because whoever comes after Putin could be worse. So maybe it's a good idea to give Putin an off-ramp, to keep him in place with limited power, and so that we don't escalate the war. Because if we do arm Ukraine, if we do enable them to physically kick Russia out of Ukraine, then Putin may decide to escalate. He may be forced to escalate because that will be his only means of survival. And he's already changing the narrative in Ukraine by saying, this is no longer a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is about a war between Russia and Europe and NATO. And we've seen extraordinary cyber attacks, incursions of NATO airspace. Who knows what Putin's going to do next? And so Europe feels that we have to respond now, whereas Trump is trying to bring him to the negotiating table. If he can spin Ukraine as a victory to the Russian people, he will go back to Russia, he will rearm, and he will try again, or he may attack another NATO state. And that is a realistic fear and really justifies Europe's stance. And because I'm not somebody who agrees with appeasement, because you're just pushing the problem down the road for somebody else. Putin is a clear and present danger today. And the problems that he's created are of his own making. So there's some very capable politicians in Russia who could take over from him. So we need perhaps a change of regime in Russia to reset things in Europe. Absolutely, Putin could come back. Putin is desperate. He wants an escape route from Ukraine because he can't afford the war in terms of casualties or in monetary terms. I mean, the sheer cost of the war and the effect on the Russian economy will have a long-term disastrous effect. So he has to get out, and he's desperate to find a way of exiting with his dignity intact. And that's the difference between the European and the US approach. Trump feels that if he allows Putin to exit with dignity, then the war will not escalate. Of course, the corresponding view, which we've just discussed, is that he could come back, is why we have a different, more aggressive stance. I think Trump is being quite realistic here. He realizes actually that Putin is a spent force. It's going to take him 5 to 10 years to rearm, unless, of course, China steps in and rearms Russia much more quickly. But I think even at home, the appetite for another war in Europe amongst ordinary Russians would be very small indeed. So I would somewhat discount the likelihood of another attack in Europe. Well, at the moment, he hasn't killed anyone. And these cyber attacks, they cost money to fix. They create problems and uncertainty and just are a disruption and a nuisance more than anything dangerous. However, if he attacks the NHS and all its systems go online and people die, that would be an act of war. Or he could just commit other NATO airspace incursions and get his aircraft shot down. And we know that's a definite possibility given European leaders' response. And of course, if he loses planes and pilots, he will be forced to respond. And of course, we have to remember that wars always start not through intended escalation, but through unintended escalation, by a disproportionate response to aggression or certain acts. And that is what we have to be very careful to avoid. So he will continue the hybrid warfare, the war in the grey zone, as we call it, until we call him out. I mean, there's nothing to stop Europe conducting its own grey zone attacks against Russia. I mean, I'm reliably told that we could bring down the Russian banking system and cause a financial collapse. But that could be so calamitous it might trigger a nuclear response or a direct attack against NATO. So we have to be very careful about how we respond to what Putin does. Putin respects strength, not weakness. And as you rightly pointed out, it's mostly our response has been tough words, not tough actions. And the best way that we can respond through what we do is by having a greater deterrent effect. And to do that, we need to rebuild our land forces in Europe. And the British Army today is in a terrible state. And I would worry if it had to deploy presently in its current condition. So I'd like to see more spent on land resources, and this to support deployments to Eastern Europe, so that Putin knows we're deadly serious, but if he oversteps the line, we will respond. Well, we know that Putin and China, Xi, have a good relationship, but how strong it is actually remains to be seen. I think if Putin started using nuclear weapons, China might cast him off quite quickly. On the other hand, China could see Russia as a means of weakening Europe and weakening the United States. And China knows that Putin has a good relationship with Trump and may try to use that to their advantage. One way in which it could do that is by rearming Russia, giving it massive military aid, which would allow it to restore its army on a much faster timeline, possibly within 5 years, which would be a significant and dangerous development. But also, China has to remember that if it acts so overtly in support of Putin, its relationship with America will deteriorate. And there's been a lot of talk about how China might invade Taiwan, but there's also a possibility that China might want to take back the Manchurian territories that it lost after the Second World War. So this was land previously owned by China that's now owned by Russia. And of course, that would create a stronger alliance between China and America because it would weaken Russia. So, China will be weighing up its options and how it wants to appear, how it will get on with America, and what it does with Russia in a way that it does not trigger World War III.